The street lamps cast long shadows across the wet pavement as a lone figure made her way through downtown Seattle's quiet streets. It was just past 10 p.m., and most of the office workers and shoppers had long since headed home. The woman walked with quiet confidence, her athletic frame moving with the fluid grace of someone completely in control of their body. She had just finished another intense training session at the Hidden Dragon Martial Arts Academy, where she both trained and taught advanced combat classes. Her muscles were pleasantly tired from the workout, but her mind remained sharp and alert, a habit ingrained from years of military service and martial arts training. As an instructor at the academy, she spent her days teaching others how to defend themselves, drawing from her wealth of experience as a special forces operative. Her students often wondered how someone so seemingly ordinary could possess such extraordinary skills. Standing at 5'4", with an athletic but unassuming build, she didn't fit the typical action hero stereotype. But that was exactly what made her so effective, both as an instructor and as a former operative. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of rain and nearby food trucks as she walked past the rows of closed shops. Her favorite coffee shop, usually bustling during the day, now stood dark and quiet. The familiar route home took her through this mix of commercial and residential areas, a path she'd walked hundreds of times before. Tonight felt different, though. Maybe it was the unusual stillness in the air, or perhaps it was her finely tuned instincts picking up on something her conscious mind hadn't yet processed. Years of combat experience had taught her to trust these feelings. Without making any obvious changes to her pace or posture, she began taking mental notes of her surroundings. The convenience store on the corner, usually open late, had closed early tonight, its windows dark and security gate pulled down. The construction site ahead had created narrow passages between the temporary barriers, limiting potential escape routes. Even the usual group of late-night restaurant workers who typically hung out behind the Thai place during their breaks were nowhere to be seen. She continued walking, maintaining her relaxed demeanor while her senses remained on high alert. Her training kicked in automatically, counting footsteps behind her, noting the rhythm and weight of the steps, cataloging potential weapons and obstacles in her environment. The heavy boots scraping against concrete told her more than enough about who might be following her. The woman's mind flashed back to her years of special forces training. She remembered the endless drills, the combat scenarios, the lessons learned in far-off places under much more dangerous circumstances than this. A small smile played across her lips as she realized these memories weren't causing anxiety. They were bringing a sense of calm preparedness. Her hand brushed against the smooth fabric of her workout bag, containing nothing more dangerous than a water bottle and a change of clothes. Not that she needed weapons. Her body itself had been trained to respond to threats with precise, controlled force. The martial arts academy where she trained emphasized practical self-defense over showy techniques, and she had mastered the art of turning an attacker's energy against them. As she approached the next intersection, she noticed how the streetlight above flickered uncertainly, creating irregular patterns of light and shadow. The timing couldn't be worse, or perhaps better, depending on how you looked at it. The footsteps behind her had grown closer, and their pace had changed. She could hear the slight quickening of breath, the telltale signs of people preparing to make their move. Most passers-by would have missed these subtle cues, but to her trained ear, they might as well have been shouting their intentions. She mentally prepared herself, running through possible scenarios while maintaining her outwardly casual appearance. The weight of her phone in her pocket reminded her that help was just a call away, but something told her she wouldn't be needing it. The cool evening air carried distant sounds of traffic from the main avenue, where late-night buses still ran their routes. A few blocks away, she could hear the bass-heavy music from the neighborhood bar, the familiar soundtrack of a typical Seattle night. These normal, everyday sounds stood in stark contrast to the tension building in the immediate vicinity. Her mind remained clear and focused, free from the panic that might grip others in this situation. Years of training had taught her that fear was natural, but controlling it was essential. She knew that what happened next would depend entirely on the choices others made. She was prepared either way. The two men had first spotted her leaving the martial arts academy, but they hadn't paid attention to the building's sign or purpose. All they saw was what they thought was an easy target, someone walking alone at night. They hung back, keeping to the shadows, thinking themselves clever and stealthy. In reality, their movements were as obvious as a neon sign to someone with proper training. The larger of the two men, wearing a dark hoodie despite the mild weather, had a distinctive limp in his right leg. His partner, shorter but muscular, kept touching his waistband nervously, a clear tell that he was carrying something he shouldn't be. They whispered to each other as they walked, their voices carrying further than they realized in the quiet night air. "Easy money," the shorter one muttered, not knowing that their target could hear every word. Their footsteps echoed off the brick buildings, creating a rhythm that any trained operative could read like a book. The slight scuff of rubber soles on concrete, the jingling of keys in a pocket, the rustle of heavy fabric, each sound painted a clear picture of their movements. The woman ahead of them maintained her pace perfectly, never too fast to appear frightened, never too slow to let them catch up too quickly. She was controlling the situation without them even realizing it. When she crossed the street, she did so at an angle that forced them to either reveal themselves by hurrying to keep up or fall too far behind to maintain their pursuit. Their breathing had changed as they followed her, slightly faster, more shallow. The signs of adrenaline beginning to flow, of predators preparing to strike. But they weren't real predators. Real predators would have noticed how their target's shoulders never tensed, how her stride never faltered, how she seemed to know exactly where they were without ever looking back. The taller man checked his phone, the blue light briefly illuminating his face. The glow revealed features hardened by bad choices rather than hard work, eyes that darted nervously despite his attempt to appear confident. His companion kept glancing around, but not with the situational awareness of a trained fighter. Instead, he showed the paranoid movements of someone afraid of getting caught. They passed a group of late-night workers leaving a restaurant, and the two men briefly separated to avoid drawing attention. It was an amateur move that only made them more noticeable. The woman ahead used this moment to demonstrate her control over the situation, subtly increasing her pace just enough to make them uncomfortable with the distance. The street ahead narrowed where construction barriers created a natural bottleneck. Any other person might have felt trapped by this development, but she recognized it as an opportunity. The confined space would limit their movement options, force them to approach in a predictable way. She could already picture exactly how they would try to corner her. Their footsteps quickened slightly as they approached the construction zone. The shorter man had moved to the left, attempting to set up a flanking position without realizing he was telegraphing his intentions. His partner remained directly behind, thinking he was being subtle as he closed the distance between them. The woman allowed herself a small smile as she sensed their excitement growing. They thought they were in control, thought they were the hunters. Their confidence was built on a foundation of assumptions about her size, her gender, her capabilities. Like so many others before them, they were about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances. In their minds, they had already played out how this would go. They had done this before. Chosen targets they thought were vulnerable, used their size and numbers to intimidate. But they had never encountered someone who was actually reading their every move, someone who had spent years training for exactly this type of situation. The air grew thicker with tension as they all approached the narrowest part of the street. The two men exchanged a quick glance, a silent signal that they were ready to make their move. They had no idea that their target had already choreographed the entire encounter in her mind, planned for every possible scenario they might attempt. The convenience store's security lights cast harsh shadows across the empty sidewalk as the moment of confrontation drew near. The neon C-Low-ZD sign buzzed quietly, its red glow adding an eerie quality to the scene. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the main road. The taller man cleared his throat, a sound meant to startle her. "Hey there," he called out, his voice trying too hard to sound friendly. "Got a minute?" It was the oldest trick in the book, trying to appear harmless while his partner moved into position. Their footsteps echoed off the storefront windows as they tried to box her in. She could smell the cigarette smoke on their clothes, mixed with the sharp scent of cheap cologne. The shorter man had already started moving to her left side, thinking he was being subtle about it. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the damp pavement, giving away his exact position even without her having to look. The woman turned slowly, deliberately. Her movement was smooth, controlled, the kind of motion that comes from thousands of hours of training. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared nervous or uncertain. In reality, she was simply positioning herself at the perfect angle to deal with both threats. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. The words carried a hint of authority that made both men hesitate for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't the response they were used to getting. Most people would have shown fear by now, but there was something in her tone that gave them pause. The streetlight above flickered, momentarily darkening the scene. In that brief moment, the woman had already noted every detail about her would-be attackers. The taller one's stance was unbalanced, his weight too far forward. The shorter one kept shifting from foot to foot, betraying his nervousness despite trying to appear tough. "Actually, you can help us," the taller man said, taking another step forward. His confidence was returning as he focused on her size rather than her demeanor. "City, my friend, and I are a bit short on cash tonight." He gestured vaguely with his hand, trying to draw her attention while his partner moved closer. The woman remained perfectly still, but every muscle in her body was ready. Years of training had taught her to remain relaxed until the exact moment action was needed. She could read their intentions in every movement, the way they tried to use their size to intimidate, how they positioned themselves to prevent escape. "I don't think I can help you with that," she replied calmly. Her words carried a warning that went right over their heads. They were too focused on what they saw, someone they thought they could easily overpower. They didn't notice how she had subtly shifted her weight, how her hands had moved to seemingly casual but strategically perfect positions. The shorter man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the buildings. "I don't think you understand," he said, taking another step closer. "We're not really asking." His hand moved toward his pocket, a gesture meant to imply threat. He was trying to appear dangerous, unaware that he was telegraphing every move. The woman's training kicked in automatically, her mind calculating distances and angles without conscious thought. She could see the overconfidence in their posture, the sloppiness in their approach. They had done this before, but they had never faced someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of situation. "Last chance," she said softly, almost kindly. "Walk away now." Her warning carried genuine concern, not for herself, but for them. She had no desire to hurt anyone, but she was fully prepared to defend herself if they forced the issue. The stillness in her voice made the taller man blink, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The air grew thick with tension as time seemed to slow down. A car passed on the distant main street, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene. In that moment, both men made their final decision, mistaking her composure for weakness. They had no way of knowing that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about judging people by their appearance. Time seemed to slow down as the woman stood facing her would-be attackers. The familiar weight of her gym bag against her shoulder reminded her of countless training sessions, of years spent preparing for moments exactly like this one. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse situations. "Listen carefully," she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. "Whatever you are thinking of doing, don't." There was something in her voice that made the taller man pause. It wasn't fear or panic. If anything, she sounded like a teacher warning students away from a bad decision. But the moment of hesitation passed quickly as the men exchanged glances. The shorter one pulled out a switchblade, the metallic click echoing off the storefront windows. He held it like someone who had watched too many movies, blade forward, arm too straight. The woman noticed how his grip was all wrong. Too tight, too rigid. She could see the slight tremor in his hand, revealing his lack of real experience with weapons. "Look at that," the taller man smirked, his confidence boosted by the sight of the blade. "Not so tough now, are you?" He cracked his knuckles, a theatrical gesture that made the woman almost want to smile. It was the kind of move that looked intimidating on TV, but telegraphed every intention in real combat. The street remained eerily quiet, broken only by the distant sound of a siren somewhere in the city. A light drizzle had started to fall, creating small halos around the streetlights. The woman took in every detail, the wet pavement that would affect footing, the narrow space between parked cars that limited movement, the security camera above the convenience store that was recording everything. "I've got something you should know," she said, her posture relaxed but ready. "I'm really not who you think I am." She spoke clearly, making sure they could hear every word. It wasn't just a warning, It was a final chance for them to make the right choice. Her eyes never left them, tracking their smallest movements with practiced ease. The shorter man waved his knife in what he thought was a threatening gesture. "Yeah? And who do we think you are?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but his voice cracking slightly. He didn't notice how she had subtly shifted her stance, how her weight was now perfectly balanced for whatever might come next. "I spent the last 15 years training for situations exactly like this," she explained patiently. "Special Forces, combat instructor, martial arts expert. The gym I just left? I teach advanced self-defense there." She kept her tone conversational, almost friendly, giving them one last chance to process what she was telling them. The taller man laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in it now. "Yeah, right, nice try." But his eyes darted to his partner, showing the first real signs of doubt. Something about the way she stood, the calm in her voice, had finally started to register. His next step forward was slightly hesitant. Rain continued to fall softly, creating a gentle percussion on nearby awnings. The woman remained perfectly still, conserving energy, letting them make their choices. Her mind was clear, focused, years of training having prepared her for this moment. She had no desire to hurt them, but she was ready to end this quickly and efficiently if they forced her hand. "Final warning," she said softly. "Walk away now, and we can all go home without anyone getting hurt." Her words hung in the air, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. She meant every word. This was about prevention, not confrontation. But they needed to make the right choice in the next few seconds. The shorter man adjusted his grip on the knife, trying to look more threatening. "Shut up," he snapped, his voice betraying his growing nervousness. "Just give us your bag and phone." He had started to sense that something was wrong, but couldn't quite figure out what. The confidence that had fueled their approach was beginning to crack. The woman's eyes flickered between them, noting every detail, their breathing patterns, muscle tension, weight distribution. She could read their intentions like an open book. The next few moments would be determined entirely by their choices, and she was prepared for any scenario they might choose. What happened next was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, but one that took place in the span of mere seconds. The taller man made the first move, lunging forward with overconfidence written in every movement. His mistake was thinking size alone would guarantee victory. He couldn't have been more wrong. The woman moved with fluid grace, had years of training evident in every precise motion. As her attacker's momentum carried him forward, she simply wasn't where he expected her to be. It was like trying to grab smoke. She seemed to flow around his attempt without actually moving much at all. Her counter was swift and efficient, using his own forward motion against him. A subtle shift of weight, a perfectly timed redirection, and suddenly the taller man found himself off balance. He had expected to encounter fear and resistance. Instead, he met skilled precision that made his strength work against him. The shorter man, still gripping his knife, stood frozen for a split second as he watched his partner's failed attack. That moment of hesitation was all she needed. Before he could process what was happening, she had closed the distance between them. Her movements were economical, precise, nothing flashy or theatrical, just pure practical efficiency. Rain continued to fall softly as the scene unfolded, the wet pavement reflecting the streetlights above. The woman's training kicked in automatically, muscle memory built from thousands of repetitions. She moved like water, flowing around threats while maintaining perfect control of the situation. The knife clattered to the ground, landing in a small puddle with a splash. Its owner hadn't even seen the disarming technique. A simple but effective move she had practiced countless times in training. One moment the weapon was in his hand, the next it was sliding across the wet pavement, well out of reach. Both men quickly found themselves in positions that defied their understanding of how fights were supposed to go. Their size and strength advantages had been completely neutralized by technique and skill. It was like trying to fight a ghost. Every attempt to grab or strike met empty air, while their own energy was used against them. The sound of their heavy breathing filled the air, mixed with the gentle patter of rain. Neither man had expected this level of skill, this complete control of the situation. Their usual tactics of intimidation and brute force were proving useless against someone who had spent years mastering the art of self-defense. The woman maintained her composure throughout, her breathing steady and controlled. She hadn't even raised her voice or shown any sign of panic. This wasn't her first confrontation, and her experience showed in every calculated movement. Each action was precise, measured, and designed to end the threat without causing unnecessary harm. The taller man tried one last desperate move, attempting to rush her again. His mistake was telegraphed in his stance, his intention clear before he even began to move. She read his body language like an open book, stepping slightly to the side while using his momentum to guide him exactly where she wanted him. The shorter man, having lost his weapon and seeing his partner's failed attempts, began to realize the magnitude of their mistake. The look of confusion on his face turned to understanding as he finally processed who they had actually tried to attack. His next move was pure instinct, but she had already anticipated it. In less time than it takes to tell the story, both men found themselves effectively neutralized. No bones were broken, no permanent damage done, just two would-be attackers discovering the hard way that appearances can be deceiving. The woman's training had emphasized control and efficiency over brutal force, and it showed in the outcome. The entire encounter had taken less than 10 seconds from start to finish. To any passersby, it might have looked like a brief dance in the rain, albeit one with very clear winners and losers. The woman stood calmly, her breathing still steady, while her would-be attackers were left wondering exactly what had just happened. Blue and red lights painted the wet streets as two police cruisers pulled up to the scene. The woman stood calmly under the convenience store's awning, protected from the light rain that continued to fall. Her would-be attackers sat on the curb, secured with zip ties from her gym bag, a precaution she always carried from her military days. The first officer who stepped out of the car immediately recognized her from the joint training sessions she had conducted at the police academy. A small smile crossed his face as he took in the scene, already having a good idea of what had transpired. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, maintaining professionalism despite his amusement at the situation. "Evening, Officer Chen," she replied, her voice still carrying the same calm it had throughout the entire incident. She had already prepared her statement in her mind, organized and clear like everything else she did. The second officer, a rookie who had attended one of her self-defense seminars, was trying hard to maintain his professional demeanor. The convenience store owner had come out to witness the scene, still holding his keys from locking up. He had watched the entire incident unfold on his security cameras and was already offering to provide the footage to the police. It was like watching a movie, he said, shaking his head in amazement. But better, because it was real. As one officer took her statement, the other ran the IDs of the two men. Their expressions shifted from frustration to concern as they learned that their would-be victim was not only highly trained, but that they themselves were wanted for a string of similar attacks in the area. Their night had gone from bad to worse in record time. "You tried to rob a Special Forces combat instructor?" The rookie officer asked them, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. The taller man just stared at the ground, while his partner muttered something about bad luck. But it hadn't been about luck, it had been about preparation meeting opportunity. The woman described the incident with precise detail, her military training evident in how she organized the information. She explained how she had noticed them following her, their amateur attempts at stealth, the warning she had given them, and the necessary defensive actions she had taken. Each detail was clear, concise, and professional. Other officers arriving on the scene exchanged knowing looks as they realized who she was. Many of them had either trained with her or heard stories about her classes. The incident would definitely be making the rounds at the precinct tomorrow, not because of its violence, but because of its perfect demonstration of controlled self-defense. The rain had begun to ease up as more details emerged. The two men had been involved in several other incidents in the area, targeting people walking alone at night. Their technique had been predictable, their approach amateur, exactly the kind of scenario she trained her students to handle. This time, they had simply chosen the wrong target. One of the officers was taking photos of the scene, documenting everything for the report. The knife, still lying in a puddle where it had fallen, was carefully bagged as evidence. The convenience store owner was already working with another officer to download the security camera footage, which would show the entire incident in clear detail. The woman's phone buzzed, a message from the martial arts academy checking if she had made it home okay, as they did with all their late-night instructors. She smiled as she replied, knowing this incident would become a teaching example in future classes. not as a story of violence, but as a demonstration of why awareness and proper training were so important. As the officers prepared to transport the two men, she heard one of them say, "Of all the people in Seattle to try this with," the irony wasn't lost on anyone present. What could have been a tragic incident had instead become a perfect example of how proper training and composure could diffuse a dangerous situation with minimal force. The morning news crews arrived at the Martial Arts Academy the next day, drawn by a story that was quickly spreading through local social media. It wasn't the violence that caught people's attention, it was the lesson behind it. The woman stood in front of her training area, surrounded by exercise mats and training equipment, as she explained what had happened. "The goal is never to fight," she told the reporter, her voice carrying the same calm confidence it had during the incident. "The goal is to be so prepared that you can handle any situation with control and clarity." Behind her, students were going through their morning routines, each movement precise and purposeful. The story resonated with people far beyond what anyone expected. Local community centers started reaching out, asking her to speak about situational awareness and self-defense. She agreed, but with one condition: the focus would be on prevention and awareness, not on combat techniques. In the following weeks, she spoke at women's shelters, community meetings, and schools. Her message was always the same. It's not about being the toughest person in the room. It's about being the most aware, the most prepared, and the most controlled. She shared simple techniques for staying alert, recognizing potential threats, and avoiding dangerous situations. The convenience store owner had framed a still image from his security camera, showing the moment she had calmly warned the two men to walk away. It hung behind his counter as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Regular customers would often stop to hear him tell the story, each retelling emphasizing the importance of not judging books by their covers. At the police station, the incident became a teaching moment in their community outreach programs. Officers used it to explain the difference between self-defense and aggression, showing how proper training could lead to controlled responses rather than escalation. The security footage became a valuable training tool, demonstrating how awareness and preparation could prevent violence. The two men, from their temporary residence at the county jail, had time to reflect on their choices. Their story became a cautionary tale about assumptions and consequences. In an unexpected twist, one of them later reached out through his lawyer, asking to apologize and thanking her for not causing them serious harm when she could have. Local martial arts schools saw an increase in enrollment, particularly from people who had never considered self-defense training before. The woman worked with other instructors to develop programs that focused on practical skills and situational awareness rather than flashy techniques. The best self-defense, she would tell new students, is being able to avoid the fight altogether. The incident sparked important conversations in the community about personal safety and preparation. Coffee shops and community boards posted tips about staying aware while walking alone, but the message wasn't about fear. It was about confidence through preparation. The woman's calm handling of the situation had shown that being prepared didn't mean being paranoid. Her story found its way into self-defense seminars across the city, not as a tale of confrontation, but as an example of how proper training creates confidence. "When you know what you're capable of," she would explain to her students, "you carry yourself differently." That confidence alone can prevent most confrontations. The most meaningful impact came from the quiet conversations she had with people who had faced similar situations. They found hope in her story, not because of the physical techniques, but because it showed how preparation and training could transform fear into capability. Each person who heard the story took away something different, but the core message remained the same. As weeks turned into months, the incident became less about that one rainy night and more about the larger lesson it taught. It wasn't just about one trained person handling a dangerous situation. It was about how anyone could learn to be more aware, more prepared, and more confident in their daily lives.